The metal vessel shivered in Hiroshi Tanaka's aged hands as he took his initial draft of frigid Coca-Cola. The saccharine, effervescent liquid met his desiccated gullet like a jolt of pure energy. Around him, fellow Japanese captives of war gazed in stunned disbelief at the American custodians distributing their hamburgers, each encased in paper. French fries arrived in cardboard receptacles, alongside bottles of fizzy pop that gleamed like molten amber beneath the intense Nevada sun. It was the month of August in the year 1945, and for these men who had lived for years with the conviction that their end would be in combat for their sovereign, this specific juncture represented something far more astonishing than their military defeat. They were experiencing their inaugural encounter with American affluence, a brief glimpse into a realm so utterly foreign it might as well have been another celestial body. Tanaka, a former petty officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, had anticipated oblivion or torment upon his apprehension during the naval engagement near the Philippine Sea. What had not crossed his mind was finding himself situated at a communal dining service in Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, observing American servicemen nonchalantly discarding half-eaten victuals into refuse receptacles, whilst he and his comrades in captivity were provided with sustenance superior to that which numerous Japanese civilians had partaken in for years. The cultural disorientation was so immense that some prisoners initially abstained from consumption, convinced the plentiful provisions were either poisoned or a component of some intricate stratagem of psychological warfare. However, this account transcends mere hamburgers and Coca-Cola. It delineates a clash between two distinct epochs, one driven by deficiency, honor, and self-denial, the other by superfluity, effectiveness, and mass fabrication. When Japanese prisoners of war encountered American internment facilities during the Second World War, they were not merely undergoing confinement. They were receiving their initial taste of a mercantile culture that would eventually revolutionize their native soil and the entire globe. The year was 1942, and the Pacific conflict was engulfing both nations in a vortex of brutality that would ultimately claim countless lives. For Japan, this was a struggle for existence against Western dominance, a hallowed conflict wherein demise was deemed preferable to capitulation. The Bushido tenets, deeply ingrained in Japanese military ethos, instructed servicemen that capture signified disgrace, not only for themselves, but also for their kin and progenitors. This was not mere indoctrination. It was a conviction system so potent that Japanese soldiers would elect death over capture, frequently terminating their own existence rather than confronting the ignominy of surrender. Concurrently, across the vast expanse of the Pacific, America was marshaling its industrial might on a scale hitherto unseen in human annals. Factories that previously manufactured automobiles were now producing tanks and aerial vehicles. Assembly lines that had revolutionized consumer merchandise were repurposed for instruments of conflict. Yet, perhaps most remarkably, the American military was also transforming the method by which it provisioned its troops and its captives. The contrast could not have been more pronounced. Japanese soldiers carried rice compacts and desiccated fish when they were fortunate enough to possess provisions at all. Many sustained themselves on whatever sustenance they could glean from arboreal environments or confiscate from enemy stores. Their apparatus was frequently improvised. Their logistical arteries stretched impossibly thin across thousands of miles of oceanic expanse. They fought with the ferocity of individuals who believed their very souls were contingent on victory. But they battled with hunger, sickness, and mounting desperation. As the hostilities protracted, American forces, in contrast, were bolstered by an industrial apparatus capable of generating not only weaponry and conveyances, but also an unending stream of processed victuals, bottled potables, and manufactured commodities. The very nation that had pioneered the assembly line and mass production was now applying those innovations to warfare on a global magnitude. When American soldiers ventured into combat, they carried K-rations that encompassed chocolate bars, tobacco sticks, and instant coffee. Upon establishing internment facilities, they brought with them the entirety of American consumer culture, inclusive of the rapid victuals and carbonated drinks that would soon astound their Japanese captives. The initial significant influx of Japanese prisoners commenced their arrival under American detainment following the Guadalcanal campaign in the latter part of 1942 and the early months of 1943. These were not the broken, dispirited warriors that American commanders might have anticipated. Many were elite combatants, naval infantry, airborne troops, and naval pilots who had been at the vanguard of Japan's early triumphs across the Pacific. They had subjugated Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Dutch East Indies. They had bombarded Pearl Harbor and held dominion over the seas from the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. Now, abruptly, they found themselves incarcerated in a domain that appeared to function under entirely divergent directives. The astonishment commenced the instant they were processed into American custody. Sergeant Yukio Matsumoto, apprehended during the combat on Saipan, subsequently recounted his amazement at the medical attention he received. The American medical practitioners cleansed my injuries with implements I had never encountered, he recollected in post-war interrogations. They possessed dressings that came in hermetically sealed casings, remedies in glass containers bearing printed inscriptions, and instruments that gleamed like silver. In Japan, even our military infirmaries were experiencing shortages of elementary provisions. Here, they seemed to possess an inexhaustible quantity of all items. But it was the victuals that truly confounded them. American military doctrine throughout the Second World War emphasized maintaining prisoners in good health and adequately provisioned, partially for pragmatic considerations. Ill prisoners necessitated greater resources, but also as an integral facet of a more extensive strategy to showcase American ascendancy. The Geneva Conventions established a minimum standard for prisoner welfare, but American facilities frequently surpassed those mandates by considerable margins. The initial repast for many Japanese prisoners under American detainment often marked their introduction to mass-produced American fare, preserved meats, processed cheeses, white bread that seemed astonishingly soft and sweet in comparison to the coarse grain products they knew from their homeland. Yet, perhaps nothing epitomized the cultural chasm more than Coca-Cola. By 1943, Coca-Cola had become so essential to American military culture that the corporation had established bottling operations adjacent to principal garrisons and even within combat zones. The sweet carbonated beverage was perceived as a comforting reminder of home for homesick enlisted men. But for Japanese prisoners encountering it for the first time, it represented something virtually unfathomable. A potable that served no nutritional objective, provided no sustenance yet was consumed purely for gratification, and widely accessible even during wartime. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Hayashi, whose aircraft was downed over the Marshall Islands, delineated his initial experience with American prison camp existence in vivid detail. They transported us to a locale that resembled a diminutive metropolis. There were edifices arranged in precise formations, complete with illumination, running water, and paved thoroughfares. The American sentinels moved with a nonchalance that bewildered us. They masticated gum, imbibed tobacco with impunity, and appeared utterly unconcerned with the conservation of resources. When they presented us with midday sustenance, I surmised it was a form of trial. The sustenance in question comprised hamburgers, French fries, and Coca-Cola, a meal that would achieve legendary status among Japanese prisoner fraternities. The hamburger, a product of assembly line creation, consisting of ground bovine flesh, manufactured cheese, and mass-produced buns, symbolized the zenith of American industrial food manufacture. The French fries, meticulously cut to uniform dimensions and deep-fried in copious cooking oil, exemplified a degree of resource availability that seemed almost miraculous to men who had been engaged in a conflict characterized by extreme scarcity. And the Coca-Cola, with its intricate formulation and extensive global distribution network, embodied the reach and sophistication of American consumer capitalism. Numerous prisoners initially declined to partake of these peculiar new edibles. Some harbored suspicions of poisoning. Others harbored concerns that accepting American hospitality would somehow compromise their sworn allegiance to the emperor. But hunger possesses a peculiar efficacy in overcoming ideology. And gradually, with apprehension, the prisoners began to sample that which their captors offered. The gustatory revelations were revolutionary. Japanese gastronomy, honed over centuries, emphasized subtle flavors, seasonal ingredients, and meticulous preparation. American fast food, in stark contrast, was devised for widespread appeal, robust flavors, and efficient ingestion. The hamburgers were savory, unctuous, and gratifying in ways that rice and fish could never be. The French fries delivered concentrated caloric content and satisfaction. The Coca-Cola provided an intense surge of sweetness that many prisoners found nearly habit-forming. Yet, beyond the sensory encounter lay something even more profound: the dawning realization of what these victuals signified. Here was a nation capable of sustaining its prisoners more adequately than many Japanese civilians were feeding themselves. Here was a military possessing such prodigious surplus production capabilities that it could manufacture effervescent beverages and dispense them freely. Here was an adversary that appeared to command resources on a scale that rendered Japan's entire war endeavor akin to a desperate gamble. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura, captured during the engagements on Iwo Jima, articulated it most concisely. We had been informed that Americans were effete, that they were feeble due to their preference for comfort over honor. But upon witnessing the sheer volume of their production, the ease with which they could engender abundance, even within internment facilities thousands of miles from their dominion, I began to comprehend that we had been engaged in a conflict we could never prevail in. The prison compounds themselves reinforced this message at every juncture: Camp Shelby in Mississippi, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Livingston in Louisiana. These installations were erected with the same industrial adroitness that characterized all other aspects of wartime America. Barracks constructed to standardized blueprints, refectories capable of feeding thousands, recreational amenities that encompassed libraries, athletic fields, and even cinematic venues. The disparity with Japanese facilities was stark. Japan's own prisoner of war camps were notoriously austere, partly attributable to cultural attitudes regarding surrender, but also due to Japan's sheer deficiency in resources to maintain extensive detention facilities. Japanese military doctrine had never envisioned the necessity of housing and provisioning vast numbers of enemy prisoners, and the nation's strained supply lines could not support such undertakings, even if the inclination had been present. American facilities, conversely, operated as miniature municipalities. They possessed their own electrical generation plants, water purification systems, and logistical networks. Trucks arrived daily bearing fresh provisions, medical supplies, and consumer goods. The refuse generated by these installations, discarded foodstuffs, packaging materials, worn garments, frequently surpassed the entirety of what entire Japanese military contingents possessed for their own use. For Japanese prisoners, observing this daily tableau of affluence was both captivating and disheartening. Many began to meticulously record in their minds the observations they made, not solely out of curiosity, but as intelligence that might prove valuable at some future juncture. What they discerned was a nation that had, in essence, industrialized warfare, applying the identical mass production methodologies that had revolutionized consumer goods to every facet of military operations. The food service alone was a logistical marvel. Meals were meticulously planned weeks in advance. Provisions were procured from suppliers spanning the entire continent. Preparation was standardized to guarantee consistency across disparate installations. The culinary apparatus, industrial ovens, mechanical mixers, refrigeration units, represented technology that most Japanese had never encountered outside of major urban centers. Even the serving implements were mass-produced to precise specifications, a far cry from the rudimentary equipment that characterized a significant portion of Japan's military infrastructure. Yet, perhaps most astonishing of all was the casual profligacy. American guards would discard half-consumed sandwiches, pour out unwanted coffee, jettison damaged packaging without a moment's consideration. For prisoners hailing from a society where every grain of rice was treasured, where families meticulously conserved and repurposed everything from twine to metallic fragments, this apparent disregard for resources was unfathomable. Some prisoners attempted to gather and preserve items that Americans carelessly discarded. Guards would frequently turn a blind eye as Japanese captives carefully folded used paper napkins, saved empty containers, or collected fragments of wood and metal. What the guards perceived as innocuous collecting, the prisoners viewed as the acquisition of precious resources that might hold value in a post-war era where scarcity would undoubtedly reassert itself. The cultural exchange operated reciprocally. American guards, many of them youthful men from provincial towns and rural locales, were often equally intrigued by their Japanese captives. Here were representatives of an enigmatic enemy culture, men who had fought with legendary ferocity, yet who now appeared almost childlike in their wonder at American abundance. Some guards began to perceive their prisoners not as faceless adversaries, but as individuals possessing their own narratives, apprehensions, and aspirations. Corporal James Mitchell from Iowa, who served as a guard at Camp McCoy, later chronicled his encounters. Initially, we believed they were all zealots who would attempt to slay us at the earliest opportunity, but observing their reactions to simple items like frozen dessert or a confectionery bar, one realizes they were merely soldiers like us. Except, they had been waging war with virtually nothing, while we possessed everything we could possibly desire, and more. These personal connections forged through shared meals and straightforward human interactions would prove pivotal in the ensuing months and years. As the conflict inexorably advanced toward its inevitable conclusion, numerous Japanese prisoners began to recognize that their pre-war assumptions regarding American society had been not only erroneous, but perilously naive. The fast foods and Coca-Cola were merely the most visible emblems of a deeper verity, that America possessed not only superior military technology, but also superior productive capacity across all strata. The identical factories that could churn out thousands of indistinguishable hamburgers could also produce tanks, aircraft, and vessels at rates that Japan could never match. The identical distribution networks that conveyed carbonated beverages to remote internment facilities could also supply munitions, fuel, and equipment to armies engaged in combat on multiple continents concurrently. As 1944 transitioned into 1945, and reports of American aerial bombardments on Japanese urban centers began to permeate the prison camps, many Japanese prisoners commenced grappling with an uncomfortable realization. They had been engaged in a conflict against an adversary whose resource base was so immense that it could afford to treat prisoners with greater consideration than Japan could extend to its own soldiers. The implications were staggering and would only become more evident as the war accelerated toward its dramatic denouement. The stage was set for revelations that would profoundly shake these prisoners, challenging every tenet they had held regarding their homeland, their enemy, and the very essence of modern warfare. But that metamorphosis was yet to unfold, concealed within the forthcoming months, like an undisclosed ingredient in a Coca-Cola concoction, poised to revolutionize all that these men believed they understood about the world. By the spring of 1945, the seemingly impossible had become commonplace within American prisoner of war camps situated across the continental United States. Japanese prisoners who had once regarded a solitary grain of rice as precious now observed American guards casually unseal fresh containers of Coca-Cola, take a few sips, and then abandon them partially consumed. Men who had been indoctrinated with the belief that death was preferable to surrender were now acquiring proficiency in operating ice cream dispensers within the camp mess halls. The transformation was not solely dietary, it was philosophical, challenging the fundamental principles of everything these prisoners had believed concerning strength, honor, and the very definition of a powerful nation. Captain Ichiro Sato, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Army's 32nd Infantry Regiment, had spent 3 months at Camp Livingston in Louisiana when he experienced what he would subsequently term his moment of complete enlightenment. It was a sweltering afternoon in May of 1945, and the camp's American commanding officer had arranged for a special indulgence. A Coca-Cola vehicle would make an appearance at the prison compound, and each prisoner would be presented with a bottle of the renowned effervescent beverage, chilled to perfection. Sato observed with rapt attention as the crimson truck arrived at the camp's perimeter. The driver, a jovial gentleman in his 50s, attired in a company uniform, commenced unloading crates of bottles with practiced efficiency. Each vessel was identical, each cap flawlessly crimped, each label imprinted with the identical flowing script that Sato had by then learned to recognize as the Coca-Cola emblem. Yet, what impressed him most profoundly was not the uniformity of the product itself. It was the unstudied abundance inherent in the entire operation. This vehicle, Sato later articulated in his memoirs, served not only our camp, but also a dozen other facilities scattered throughout Louisiana. The driver informed us, through an interpreter, that his company manufactured millions of these bottles daily, catering not exclusively to the military, but also to ordinary civilians who could procure them at any neighborhood establishment. I attempted to envision millions of bottles being manufactured each day, and I found myself incapable of doing so. In Japan, we held a single orange in high esteem. Here, they were industrially producing liquid refreshment on a scale that utterly overwhelmed the senses. The Coca-Cola distribution network, which seemed so routine to Americans, represented something revolutionary to the Japanese prisoners. Here was a single corporation that had successfully established production and distribution channels extending across an entire continent and beyond. Coca-Cola bottling facilities were operational within combat zones on remote islands, wherever American forces were deployed. The identical logistical capacity that could deliver carbonated beverages to the heart of Louisiana could also deliver ordnance to the forward combat zones in the Pacific, fuel to aircraft carriers, and medical provisions to field hospitals. However, it was not merely the magnitude that captivated the prisoners. It was the apparent effortlessness with which it was all accomplished. American abundance seemed to flow as naturally as water from a faucet. Sustenance materialized in the mess halls thrice daily without fail. Clean attire was distributed on a weekly basis. Medical supplies never appeared to dwindle. Entertainment, films, books, sporting equipment, arrived with regularity as if an unseen entity was meticulously monitoring the morale of enemy combatants and ensuring their access to diversions that most Japanese civilians could only dream of. Lieutenant Masao Fujiwara, a naval aviator whose aircraft was shot down over Guadalcanal, found himself assigned duties within the camp's kitchen as part of the prisoner labor initiative. What he uncovered there challenged everything he believed he understood about food production and military logistics. The kitchen received daily deliveries of meat, vegetables, dairy products, and processed foodstuffs in quantities that would have sustained his entire squadron for weeks. Industrial-sized cans of vegetables, colossal blocks of cheese, sides of beef that necessitated the combined effort of multiple individuals to transport. The sheer volume of sustenance flowing through a solitary prison camp was astonishing. I had been instructed that Americans were feeble due to their indulgence, that they prioritized comfort over sacrifice, Fujiwara reflected later. Yet, by laboring in that kitchen, I began to comprehend that their perceived weakness was, in fact, a form of strength we had never conceived of. They had constructed a society so exceptionally productive, so remarkably efficient, that they could afford to extend generosity even to their adversaries. This was not a deficit. It represented power of an entirely different classification. The kitchen assignments also afforded Fujiwara insights into American dietary customs that extended far beyond mere superfluity. He learned that many of the comestibles he was assisting in preparing, hamburgers, hot dogs, French fries, were relatively recent innovations, products of industrialization and mass fabrication, rather than ancient culinary traditions. The ubiquitous burger, a culinary innovation, was conceived as a practical and expedient method for feeding the industrial workforce. French fries emerged as a uniformly produced commodity, prepared with identical consistency across dining establishments nationwide. Even Coca-Cola, with its meticulously guarded proprietary blend, stood as a testament to the prowess of industrial chemistry and widespread commercial outreach. These sustenance items transcended mere nutritional value. They were emblematic of a civilization that had mastered the art of standardizing enjoyment, mass-producing contentment, and transforming the act of dining into a streamlined, optimized undertaking. This stood in stark opposition to Japanese gastronomy, which prioritized seasonal provisions, meticulous culinary artistry, and visually appealing presentations. While both methodologies possessed their own virtues, only one possessed the logistical capability to sustain vast numbers of combatants engaged in a global conflict. As the year 1945 advanced and intelligence regarding the war's progression filtered into internment facilities, a significant psychological metamorphosis began to occur among many Japanese internees. The sheer plenty they observed daily within American detention centers compelled them to reevaluate every tenet they had been indoctrinated with concerning their adversary and the fundamental objectives of their nation's wartime endeavors. Sergeant Hiroshi Yamamoto, apprehended during the hostilities on Saipan, articulated this sentiment with unvarnished directness in correspondence penned subsequent to the war. We were informed that America was a populace of frail individuals who would falter at the slightest indication of genuine adversity. Yet here I was, a captive of war, partaking in meals superior to any I had experienced during years of military service in Japan. If this was their treatment of adversaries, how remarkably must they have treated their own citizens? And if they possessed the financial wherewithal for such munificence during wartime, what did that reveal about the true distribution of strength in this confrontation? This quandary weighed heavily on numerous captives as the summer of 1945 progressed. Dispatches from the Pacific Theater grew increasingly dire for Japan. American aerial bombardments ranged with impunity over Japanese urban centers, and the sentinels at the POW camps spoke openly of an assured triumph. A segment of the internees clung to the hope that Japan's legendary martial spirit would somehow lead to a favorable outcome. However, the tangible evidence of American industrial dominance was pervasive, as conspicuous as the discarded Coca-Cola receptacles accumulating in refuse bins and the hamburger wrappers strewn across picnic surfaces. The denouement, when it arrived, was abrupt and startling. On the 15th day of August, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announcing the surrender reached the internment camps via Japanese-language radio transmissions. For a considerable number of internees, this intelligence was profoundly disheartening, not solely due to their nation's defeat, but because the stark reality of capitulation compelled them to confront the extent of their misapprehension regarding the nature of the struggle they had been engaged in. In the aftermath of Japan's capitulation, a remarkable phenomenon unfolded within American POW facilities. The psychological fortifications separating captors and captives began to erode in ways that would have seemed inconceivable mere weeks prior. American custodians, many of whom had sustained personal losses of kin and comrades in the Pacific War, found themselves sharing repasts and discussions with former adversaries who no longer appeared as dangerous zealots, but rather as fellow human beings attempting to comprehend a world in flux. The rapid service comestibles and carbonated beverages, once signifying an unfamiliar culture, now served as conduits for mutual understanding. Japanese internees who had initially regarded hamburgers and Coca-Cola with suspicion soon discovered solace in these familiar camp provisions. Some guards initiated instruction for the captives in the preparation of American dishes, while the internees, in turn, shared their methods for preparing rice and vegetables in novel ways that had previously eluded the imagination of American culinary practitioners. Private Kenji Suzuki, who had resided at Camp McCoy for over a year, characterized the post-surrender interval as a period of profound enlightenment. Prior to the armistice, I consumed American fare out of necessity due to hunger, with no alternative. Post-armistice, I commenced to grasp the significance of this cuisine. It was not merely about provision in an efficient manner. It entailed the cultivation of a shared experience, a common cultural fabric capable of uniting individuals from diverse backgrounds. Observing American servicemen from disparate states, varied ethnic origins, all deriving pleasure from identical hamburgers and Coca-Cola, I began to apprehend a crucial facet of American societal dynamics. This perception would prove prescient. In the months subsequent to Japan's surrender, as the process of internee repatriation commenced, a significant number found themselves disinclined to return to a homeland they now recognized as poorly understood. The Japan they had departed was a society founded upon scarcity, rigid stratification, and self-denial. The America they had encountered was built upon abundance, operational efficiency, and widespread consumerism. This disparity ignited unsettling inquiries regarding which paradigm would demonstrate greater efficacy in the post-war era. The repatriation procedure itself offered a concluding pedagogical experience in American organizational acumen. Internees were processed through vast staging areas where they received new attire, underwent medical evaluations, and obtained necessary documentation. The logistical undertaking was monumental. Thousands of former POWs, each requiring individual attention, were guided through a system that functioned with meticulous precision. Throughout this entire operation, the comforting elements of American mass culture remained present. Nourishing meals served on standardized platters, chilled effervescent beverages accessible at every juncture, amusements and diversions provided with the same regularity as medical attention. Many internees were presented with provisions parcels for their homeward journey, containing articles that would have been considered luxury items in wartime Japan. Confectionery bars, tobacco products, preserved foodstuffs, and indeed, bottles of Coca-Cola for the extended maritime voyage back to their devastated nation. This magnanimity was both touching and strategically calculated, a final demonstration of American plenitude intended to imbue these former adversaries with a profoundly altered comprehension of the nation they had opposed. The vessels that transported Japanese internees back to their ancestral land in the latter part of 1945 and the early months of 1946 were themselves testaments to American industrial power. Many were Liberty-class ships, cargo carriers produced en masse, which American shipyards had constructed at an astonishing rate, one every few days during the war's zenith. These maritime carriers, laden with repatriated individuals and humanitarian aid, embodied the same productive capacity that had ensured the availability of hamburgers and Coca-Cola in remote internment facilities throughout the conflict. As these ships neared the Japanese coast, numerous repatriating personnel obtained their initial view of the devastation wrought by American aerial assaults upon their homeland. Cities lay in ruins, harbors were encumbered by submerged vessels, and the industrial infrastructure that had once inspired such admiration in Japanese observers was now revealed as rudimentary when contrasted with their experiences in America. This contrast evoked both heartbreak and profound revelation. Hiroshi Tanaka, the former naval sergeant whose narrative initiated our account, stood at the railing of a repatriation vessel as it entered Tokyo Bay in December of 1945. In his personal effects was a nearly depleted bottle of Coca-Cola, which he had been preserving for this precise moment. Gazing upon the devastated panorama of his native land, he took a final draught of the sweet, effervescent beverage that had come to represent the totality of his newfound understanding of American might and affluence. "I came to realize," he later recounted, "that we had been engaged not merely in a war, but in a fundamental redefinition of what a contemporary society was capable of achieving. We had approached the confrontation as if it were still the 19th century, as though sheer resolve and personal sacrifice could surmount industrial capacity and technological advancement. The Americans, conversely, had conceptualized it as an engineering challenge to be resolved through mass fabrication and efficient distribution. Observing the wreckage of Tokyo, it became unequivocally apparent which approach had yielded superior outcomes. However, the narrative does not conclude with defeat and desolation. In the subsequent years, many former POWs acted as intermediaries between the two cultures, contributing to Japan's reconstruction, based on principles they had first encountered within American detention camps. The abundance they had witnessed, the efficiency they had observed, the casual prosperity that had initially seemed so foreign, all of these became models for Japan's remarkable post-war resurgence. The fast food items and carbonated beverages that had initially astonished Japanese internees were among the earliest American cultural imports to achieve widespread acceptance in occupied Japan. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was being bottled domestically in Japan, and American-style eateries were gaining popularity in metropolitan centers. The former adversaries transformed into eager students, keen to assimilate the secrets of plenitude and operational effectiveness they had first encountered as prisoners of war. Some of the very individuals who had once regarded hamburgers and French fries with astonishment became pioneering entrepreneurs in the new Japan, establishing enterprises grounded in the principles of mass production and standardization observed in American POW facilities. Others transitioned into educational roles, imparting to a new generation of Japanese citizens the significance of industrial efficiency and consumer contentment. A select few even entered the diplomatic corps, facilitating the establishment of a partnership that would transform former antagonists into steadfast allies. This transformation extended beyond the economic realm, encompassing cultural and psychological dimensions. The Japan that emerged from the occupation was a nation that had embraced abundance over scarcity, efficiency over rote adherence to tradition, and prosperity over mere subsistence. The young Japanese who matured within this new societal framework would come to regard hamburgers and Coca-Cola with the same familiarity as rice and tea, perceiving them not as symbols of foreign subjugation, but as emblems of contemporary affluence. Presently, Japan stands as one of the world's preeminent prosperous nations, a leader in technological innovation and manufacturing, a society that has attained mastery in the art of mass production. Visitors to Tokyo or Osaka can locate McDonald's establishments offering hamburgers and Coca-Cola on nearly every street, indistinguishable from their American counterparts. The foodstuffs that once symbolized an alien culture have become as intrinsically Japanese as sushi and sake. Yet, perhaps the most profound legacy of those internment camp encounters resides not in the proliferation of fast food, but in the fundamental alteration of perspectives regarding the potential achievements of a society that prioritizes abundance over deprivation, efficiency over established customs, and pragmatic resolutions over ideological rigidity. The Japanese internees who marveled at American plenty in 1945 lived to witness their own country evolve into a paradigm of prosperity and efficiency, studied and emulated by other nations. The metallic chalice may no longer exhibit tremor, the burgers may no longer appear peculiar, and the Coca-Cola may have relinquished its capacity to shock. However, the lesson remains as germane today as it was in those sweltering detention camps of 1945. That genuine fortitude in the contemporary global landscape emanates not from a readiness for sacrifice, but from the inherent capacity to innovate, to generate, to cultivate abundance where once there was deficiency. Ultimately, the Japanese internees who found the concept of fast food and Coca-Cola incomprehensible within American POW facilities unearthed something more valuable than any military intelligence or strategic secret. They discovered the potent influence of an alternative conceptualization of human potential, one that would ultimately contribute to the transformation not only of Japan, but of the entire modern world. The carbonated beverage and the paper-wrapped hamburger had carried within them the nascent elements of a revolution that would reshape the global economy and redefine the essence of living in affluence and tranquility. The hostilities had concluded, but the true triumph, the victory of abundance over scarcity, of efficiency over waste, of hope over despair, was merely commencing.